You're lying on a wet wooden deck at dawn, 1100 years ago, somewhere in the middle of the North Atlantic, and the wave that hit an hour ago is still soaked into every layer of wool you own. Back home, you complain when the apartment radiator takes 10 minutes to warm up. Out here, there's no radiator, no cabin, no wall between you and the water at all. Just an open hull, a single mast, and a crew doing this for weeks at a time in temperatures hovering right around freezing. Here's the part that shouldn't add up. Entire crews made crossings like this every year, some lasting 3 weeks with no land in sight, and most of them lived. The strangest detail in the whole story isn't how they survived it. It's what they built the entire system around, something you probably still own, sitting in the back of your closet. Hypothermia doesn't kick down the door. It creeps in quietly, dulling fingers, then thoughts, then judgment. Long before most people even register, they're in danger. Shivering, the body's own first line of defense, actually stops working once core temperature drops far enough, which means the moment a sailor feels like the worst has passed can be exactly the moment things are going wrong fastest. Sea surface temperatures across the open stretches of this route can sit just a few degrees above freezing even during the safest sailing months, and the air gets colder still once the wind picks up. That's the real threat behind this whole story, and it's why almost everything about a voyage like this, from the clothes on a sailor's back to the food packed in the hold, was built to fight something that can kill without ever raising its voice. It starts with a material you're probably picturing all wrong. Wool, soaked through, keeps doing something cotton simply can't. Its fibers are coiled, almost spring-shaped, and they trap pockets of air even while the fabric outside is dripping. Norse sailors didn't understand the science. They understood the results, and they built an entire wardrobe around it. A linen or wool undergarment against the skin, long wool tunics over that, wool leg wraps bound tight from ankle to knee, and a heavy wool cloak on top, pinned at the shoulder and worn long enough to double as a blanket after dark. Socks, mittens, and hats were often made with a technique called nail binding, a single needle looping method that predates knitting and produces a denser, tighter fabric exactly where heat escapes fastest: fingers, toes, ears. Textile fragments pulled from the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, a grave so well preserved that fabric survived inside it for more than 1,000 years, show wool woven in a weave tight enough to block most of the wind on its own. But wool alone had a limit. Spray off open water doesn't just dampen a cloak once. It soaks it, over and over, for hours at a stretch, until even good wool starts losing the fight. So sailors worked animal fat into the outer layers by hand, the same idea behind a modern raincoat's coating, until the wool turned water-resistant instead of merely warm. It wasn't glamorous, and it almost certainly didn't smell great in close quarters. Nobody on that ship was fighting for the seat next to the guy who'd just finished re-greasing his cloak. Grease solved the water falling from above. It did nothing about the water already inside the hull. Viking ships were clinker-built, overlapping planks riveted together, which made them fast and flexible in rough seas, but never fully sealed. Seawater worked its way in constantly, pooling as bilge water around the crew's feet no matter how carefully the ship was built. Bailing wasn't an occasional chore. It was a rotating job, worked in shifts alongside the rowing, because standing ankle-deep in freezing water for hours was its own fast route to hypothermia, wool socks or not. Even dry feet couldn't fix what happened after the rowing stopped. Once the sun went down and the body's own furnace slowed with it, sailors climbed into something closer to a sleeping sack than a blanket. A bag sewn from thick hide, sometimes large enough for 2 people, because 2 bodies sharing one hide sack lose heat far slower than one body alone. That solved the sleeping problem. It did nothing about the wind cutting sideways across an open deck, or the spray that kept coming even at anchor. Whenever a crew could reach land, they solved that part by getting off the water completely, hauling the ship up onto a beach and rigging the sail up over a wooden frame, turning the same fabric that caught wind at sea into a low tent that blocked it on land. Here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind by now. What happened on the crossings where there was no land to reach at all? The route from Norway to Iceland could run a week without a coastline in sight. Iceland to Greenland could take longer. No beach, no tent, no fire, just open water, in the same cold, for days on end. The answer sailors landed on was almost stubbornly simple: keep moving. Rowing crews worked in shifts, partly to keep the ship on course, but mostly because pulling an oar generates more body heat than nearly anything else available on that deck. When wind did the work instead, the sailors not currently rowing didn't just sit still. They checked rigging, moved cargo, anything that kept blood reaching, fingers and toes. And crews who had a choice in the matter overwhelmingly chose not to sail in the deep of winter at all, timing departures for the parts of the year when an exposed crossing was survivable instead of a gamble. None of this was a one-time gamble either way. Norse sailors settled Iceland by the 870s, reached Greenland under Eric the Red around 985, and pushed as far as the coast of Newfoundland under his son, Leif Erikson, not long after. Farmland was scarce back home, trade routes paid well, and a new coastline meant a fresh start for people with little left to lose. Reasons strong enough that generation after generation kept choosing the same freezing crossing anyway. That's not a single daring voyage told once around a fire. That's roughly a century and a half of ordinary people repeating the exact same crossing as a normal part of life, not an extreme feat reserved for legends. We love the story of the Viking sailor who simply didn't feel the cold, some kind of natural immunity built into the blood. It's a great image. It's also not what actually happened. In 2007, the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, Denmark, launched a full-size replica longship called the Sea Stallion, crewed by ordinary modern volunteers, and sailed it along the historical trade route from Denmark to Dublin using nothing but Viking-age tools, rigging, and clothing. Nobody on that crew had been bred for cold tolerance. They survived the same way the original sailors did. The layering, the greased wool, the shared hide sacks, the constant movement. And it worked on 21st century bodies with 0 generations of hardening behind them. The cold wasn't beaten by toughness. It was beaten by a system. There's a piece of this story that doesn't make it into the highlight reel, though. The system worked remarkably well right up until it didn't. Norse sources record entire crews lost on specific crossings. No monsters, no battles, just weather, cold, and exhaustion doing exactly what they do to an exposed body with no backup plan. All of this reduced the risk. None of it erased it. Reducing that risk still needed fuel, and fuel was the one thing an open ship couldn't easily replace mid-voyage. So the food carried aboard wasn't chosen for taste. It was chosen for density. Dried fish, preserved until it could last for months, packed enormous protein into almost no weight. Butter, sometimes stored buried in peat bogs to keep it from spoiling, delivered pure fat exactly when a freezing body needed it most. Skyr, a thick, soured dairy product still eaten across Iceland today, held up without refrigeration far longer than it should have and could be eaten cold, straight from its container. And instead of water that might already be turning in a wooden cask, crews often reached for ale or mead. Mildly alcoholic, but far less likely to make an entire ship's worth of people sick on the same day. None of it sounds appetizing by modern standards. Nobody was photographing their plate of soured dairy and old fish. A half-frozen sailor at the end of a rowing shift wasn't reading the menu. Surviving the cold solved the body's half of the problem. It never solved the mind's. Weeks of identical gray water, identical cold, and identical exhausted faces wears on a crew fast, and Norse culture leaned hard on oral storytelling to fill that gap. Sagas, genealogies, and verse passed voice to voice, partly for entertainment, partly because a crew focused on a story is a crew that's not fixating on how cold and miserable it actually is. It's a strange thing to realize. Some of the same tales still read today. The ones full of gods and monsters and impossible voyages may have first been told out loud on a deck exactly like this one, to keep a freezing crew's mind somewhere warmer than their body. Dense food and a good story solved the fuel and the boredom. Neither solved the smaller, more immediate problem. Hands and feet, the first parts of the body the cold goes after, especially for men gripping wet rope and wet oar handles for hours without a break. The tightly looped wool socks and mittens, treated with the same grease as everything else, protected against the worst of it, and crews rotated jobs deliberately so no single set of hands stayed locked around a freezing oar for an entire shift. It sounds like a small detail next to an ocean crossing. Nobody writes an epic saga about excellent sock hygiene, but frostbite could end a voyage just as fast as a storm could. Picture the ship again, not the version from movies, with fur capes and roaring fires and men shouting bravely into the wind. The real one. Open to the sky, salt-crusted, packed with tired, cold people wrapped in wet wool, rowing through the one thing keeping their blood moving at all. They didn't survive that ocean because the cold didn't touch them. They survived it because every layer, every hide sack, every greased cloak was one small answer to a problem, stacked on top of a dozen others, tested against a threat that has been killing people since long before there were ships to sail. None of it was heroic in the way the stories tell it. It was patient, unglamorous, repeated work, done in the cold, by people who simply refused to accept that the ocean got to decide who lived. Iceland, Greenland, the edge of North America. Entire nations exist today because ordinary people kept making that same freezing crossing year after year and kept finding ways to survive it. That sweater sitting in the back of your closet is a distant descendant of that whole system. You've just never once needed it to keep you alive.